Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Inspector here for another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard here on this 29th day of March. Quickly closing on the end of the month here, April 1st, right around the corner. On tonight's broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit about Cloward-Piven, the old strategy here. We're going to get into that and how it's been used over the years. I'm going to dig back into the old archives dating back to when 44 was still in office, pull a couple articles out of my own personal archives from back then, and how it's also being applied here today. So stick around, we'll see you back here momentarily. Rule number one: have but what the enemy thinks you have. Never go outside the expert people. Go outside the expertise up to its own book of rules. Rule number 5: man's. Rule number 6: a good tactic is one your people enjoy. A tactic that drags on too long is a drag. On, let up. Rule number 9: the threat is usually more terrifying than itself. Rule number 10: is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. Rule number 11: if you push a negative hard enough, you'll push through. Rule number 12: the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. Rule number 13: freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. At least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first from all theology and history wins, or which is which. The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom. Lucifer, by Saul Alinsky. Yet another day by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Like I said here on the broadcast tonight, we're going to get into a little Cloward-Piven and how it is being applied here as we see things unfold in these United States now. And of course, for those who have followed the intel and all the stuff behind the scenes over the course of the last 3 or so plus years, you definitely know and should be aware of the 16-year plan. And of course, that plan started under 44, Barack Hussein Obama. A lot of these same tactics were being deployed back then. And so tonight on the broadcast, I thought it'd behoove us to kind of take a step back, go back in the old archives here, dig up a couple articles and that pertaining to the old Cloward-Piven strategy, and we'll delve into what exactly it is, as well as how it was used even back then and where we stand here yet even today. So that being said, let me take us over to my Patreon page, and I've got a lot of stuff archived over there. If you're not over there, go ahead and get subscribed. Check it out. But one of the very first ones in that I have, dating back, way back, about an 1,800-page document here, one of my PCO docs in that I put out on a monthly basis. I'm going to actually go through and scroll through and find this guy. Do a little Control F here. We'll do a little Cloward. Find this on the fly. And there we have it right there. We'll jump right down to it. And so an article that dates all the way back to, looks like about February of 2015. And the article is titled at that time, Cloward-Piven Theory of Collapsing America is Working Because We Are Too Lazy to Collectively Stop It. Authored by John Proteus back then. Interesting little meme that they had back then, and it's fitting because I'm going to touch upon one of these characters here, but nonetheless, as lucky for us, the conservatives are dumb enough not to figure it out. Let them have their Levins and Hannitys and Limbaughs bitch all they want, so long as they don't call for revolution. It's okay. By the time they realize it, it'll be too late. So yes, we are late in the game, obviously, at this point, but nonetheless, we're still talking about it. And hey, we still got our First Amendment. We're still going to use the avenues in that we have. That being said, Cloward-Piven Theory of Collapsing America is working because we are too lazy to collectively stop it. The DOJ dilemma. Yeah, right. Dilemma or delight. So many illegal aliens, the courts can't handle them. Well, mind you, this is from 2015, 6+ years ago. Story almost reads verbatim the same, so see how this relays to and parallels what we see going on here today. This out of San Antonio, thousands of immigrants seeking legalization through the U.S. court system have had their hearings canceled and are being told by the government that it may be 2019 or later before their futures are resolved. Now, mind you, again, this is 2015, add 4 years to that, add another couple, and it gets you to where we're at now. So some immigration lawyers fear the delay will leave their clients at risk of deportation as evidence becomes dated, witnesses disappear, sponsoring relatives die, and dependent children become adults. The increase in cancellations began late last summer after the Justice Department prioritized the tens of thousands of Central American migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, most of them mothers with children and unaccompanied minors. Immigration lawyers in cities that absorbed a large share of those cases, including New York, San Antonio, Los Angeles, and Denver, say they've had hearings canceled with little notice and received no new court dates. Work permits, green cards, asylum claims, and family reunifications hang in the balance. Denver immigration lawyer David Simmons said he had never seen such a standstill in nearly 30 years of practice. There is no maneuverability, he said. It's as if we have no court at all. And says one of Simmons' clients, Maximo Vasquez Guevara, 34, recently won his appeal to become a legal permanent resident. But his case still needs to go in front of an immigration judge one last time, and it has been pulled from the docket. Vasquez, who is from the Mexican state of Guanajuato, entered the U.S. illegally in 1998. He has been fighting deportation since 2011, when he came to authorities' attention after his second driving under the influence charge. He lives in suburban Denver with his American wife, Ashley Bowen, and their 6-year-old daughter, and they are expecting their second child in August. Meanwhile, Vasquez's brother in Mexico is dying of kidney failure, and Vasquez can't leave the country. It's sad, Vasquez said in a telephone interview. I feel bad not seeing him to say one last goodbye. Before July, only immigrants in detention were considered a priority for the courts. Under the new policies, unaccompanied minors and families facing deportation also have priority status, regardless of whether they're in detention. The Executive Office for Immigration Review, the Justice Department body that oversees the nation's immigration courts, could not say precisely how many hearings had been canceled, but it said more than 415,000 immigrants who are not in detention have cases pending. Now again, I'm reminding you, if you're late coming in, this article is dated back to 2015 under Barack Hussein Obama's admin at the time, but the parallels I thought were rather uncanny. Hearings are being rescheduled for November 29, 2019, as a way to keep cases on the docket, said Lauren Elder Reed, Legislative and Public Affairs Counsel for EOIR. Most, however, are likely to receive other dates, either earlier or later, as docket times become available, she said. Simmons said thousands of non-party cases in Denver alone have had hearings canceled. When the surge hit last summer, immigration courts there were already short 2 judges because of retirements. 2 of the 3 remaining Denver immigration judges are hearing via video conference cases of families detained in a new detention center in South Texas. The 3rd Denver judge is hearing cases involving unaccompanied minors who have been placed with relatives. David Martin, a law professor at the University of Virginia who worked for 2 Democratic presidents, criticized Congress and the Obama administration for not funding more immigration judges. You fund more investigators, more detention space, more border patrol. Almost all of these people are going to produce some kind of immigration court case, he said. You are putting a lot more people into the system. It's just going to be a big bottleneck unless you increase the size of that pipeline. San Antonio's immigration courts, which, like Denver's, are handling a large number of unaccompanied children and detained families, also have seen the cancellations of all non-detainee hearings, which are not considered priority. Lance Cutright, a San Antonio lawyer, said hearings have been posted for hundreds of cases his firm is handling. Longtime green card holders face deportation over minor crimes or procedural issues are going to suffer needlessly along with their families, he said. This is their home, and they don't know if they're going to be forcibly removed from it, he said, and they're not going to get any resolution on that until 2019. So, let's see. Limbo does not jeopardize all immigrants facing deportation, as many are still able to work under existing permits until their cases can be heard. The delays might even provide some immigrants with weaker petitions more time to build a stronger case. Moving the docket back 4 years to some people will be devastating, said Anthony Drago, an immigration lawyer in Boston. To other people, it's, wow, 4 years in the United States. Asylum seekers who often have had to leave behind families in countries ravaged by war and violence are among the hardest hit, said Brian Johnson Zenidalus, an immigration lawyer in New York. His firm has had 8 case hearings canceled so far, including that of a severely disabled young man from Ukraine with an asylum petition. Another dozen asylum cases at his firm have not been scheduled. Many fear that cases like these will linger indefinitely at the bottom of the pile if there's another wave of Central American migrants. Starting May or June, there is likely going to be another surge of unaccompanied kids or families, said Manoj Govindaya, a lawyer for the San Antonio-based Refugee and Immigration Center for Education and Legal Services. Presumably, this issue is going to continue. And of course, at the time that was published on Discover the Networks. So now, let's get into what exactly this Cloward-Piven strategy is, for those that don't know. And this is going to be a little bit of a read, so I'm going to take a little swig here behind the scenes here to wet the old whistle here quick. And we'll get into it. This was published back in 2005. Says, first proposed in 1966 and named after Columbia University sociologists Richard Andrew Cloward and Francis Fox Piven. The Cloward-Piven strategy seeks to hasten the fall of capitalism by overloading the government bureaucracy with a flood of impossible demands, thus pushing society into crisis and economic collapse. Inspired by the August 1965 riots in the Black District of Watts in Los Angeles, which erupted after police had used batons to subdue an African-American man suspected of drunk driving, Cloward and Piven published an article titled The Weight of the Poor, A Strategy to End Poverty, in the May 2, 1966 issue of The Nation. Following its publication, The Nation sold an unprecedented 30,000 reprints. Activists were abuzz over the so-called crisis strategy, or Cloward-Piven strategy, as it came to be called. Many were eager to put it into effect. In their 1966 article, Cloward and Piven charged that the ruling classes used welfare to weaken the poor, that by providing a social safety net, the rich doused the fires of rebellion. Poor people can advance only when the rest of society is afraid of them, Cloward told the New York Times on September 27, 1970. Rather than placating the poor with government handouts, wrote Cloward and Piven, activists should work to sabotage and destroy the welfare system. The collapse of the welfare state would ignite a political and financial crisis that would rock the nation. Poor people would rise and revolt. Only then would the rest of society accept their demands. The key to sparking the rebellion would be to expose the inadequacy of the welfare state. Cloward-Piven's early promoters cited radical organizer Saul Alinsky as their inspiration. Make the enemy live up to their sick own book of rules, Alinsky wrote in his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals. When pressed to honor every word of every law and statute, every Judeo-Christian moral tenet, and every implicit promise of the liberal social contract, human agencies inevitably fall short. The system's failure to live up to its rulebook can then be used to discredit it altogether and to replace the capitalist rulebook with a socialist one. The authors noted that the number of Americans subsisting on welfare, about 8 million at the time, probably represented less than half the number who were technically eligible for full benefits. They proposed a massive drive to recruit the poor onto the welfare rolls. Cloward and Piven calculated that persuading even a fraction of potential welfare recipients to demand their entitlements would bankrupt the system. The result, they predicted, would be a profound financial and political crisis that would unleash powerful forces for major economic reform at the national level. Their article called for cadres of aggressive organizers to use demonstrations to create a climate of militancy. Intimidated by threats of black violence, politicians would appeal to the federal government for help. Carefully orchestrated media campaigns carried out by friendly left-wing journalists would float the idea of a federal program of income redistribution in the form of a guaranteed living income for all, working and non-working people alike. Local officials would clutch at this idea like drowning men to a lifeline. They would apply pressure on Washington to implement it, with every major city erupting into chaos. Washington would have to act. This was an example of what are commonly called Trojan horse movements, mass movements whose outward purpose seems to be providing material help to the downtrodden, but whose real objective is to draft poor people into service as revolutionary foot soldiers, to mobilize poor people en masse to overwhelm government agencies with a flood of demands beyond the capacity of those agencies to meet. The flood of demands was calculated to break the budget, jam the bureaucratic gears into gridlock, and bring the system crashing down. Fear, turmoil, violence, and economic collapse would accompany such a breakdown, providing perfect conditions for fostering radical change. That was the theory. And I guess I'll pause there right quick just to say, how well do you see that playing out on the streets here today? Think of what has happened since the Floyd stuff took place last summer. All the cities on fire, still on fire in some cases, Portland, the Antifa folks out there, the BLMs, the downtrodden and that are the foot soldiers. Are those not the very people, the brown shirts equivalents that 44 was talking about back in the day? Pretty close. And then, of course, hey, let's flood the borders at the same time. Let's put a groundswell of folks in to overwhelm the system. And here you go. Cloward and Piven recruited a militant black organizer named George Wiley to lead their new movement. The three met in January 1966 at a radical organizers meeting in Syracuse, New York, called the Poor People's War Council on Poverty. Wiley listened to the Cloward-Piven plan with interest. That same month, he launched his own activist group, the Poverty Rights Action Center, headquartered in Washington, D.C. In a calculated show of militancy, he sported dashikis, jeans, battered shoes, and a new newly grown afro. Regarding the Cloward-Piven strategy, Wiley told one audience, "A lot of us have been hampered in our thinking about the potential here by our own middle-class backgrounds. And I think most activists basically come out of middle-class backgrounds. And we're oriented toward people having to work, and that we have to get as many people as possible off the welfare rolls. However, I think that this Cloward-Piven strategy is going to catch on and be very important in the time ahead." After a series of mass marches and rallies by welfare recipients in June 1966, Wiley declared the birth of a movement, the Welfare Rights Movement. Cloward and Piven publicly outlined their strategy at the Second Annual Socialist Scholars Conference, held in September 1966 at New York City's Hotel Commodore. To read an eyewitness account of their presentation, we can click here. It says, in the summer of 1967, Ralph Wiley founded the National Welfare Rights Organization, NWRO. His tactics closely followed the recommendations set out in Cloward and Piven's article. His followers invaded welfare offices across the United States, often violently, bullying social workers and loudly demanding every penny to which the law entitled them. By 1969, NWRO claimed a dues-paying membership of 22,500 families, with 523 chapters across the nation. Regarding Wiley's tactics, the New York Times commented on September 27, 1970, there have been sit-ins in legislative chambers, including a United States Senate committee hearing, mass demonstrations of several thousand welfare recipients, school boycotts, picket lines, mounted police, tear gas, arrests, and, on occasion, rock throwing, smashed glass doors, overturned desks, scattered papers, and ripped out phones. These methods proved effective. The flooding succeeded beyond Wiley's wildest dreams, wrote Saul Stern in the City Journal. From 1965 to 1974, the number of households on welfare soared from 4.3 million to 10.8 million, despite mostly flush economic times. By the early 1970s, one person was on the welfare rolls in New York City for every two working in the city's private economy. The National Welfare Rights Organization pushed for a guaranteed living income, as prescribed by Cloward and Piven, which it defined in 1968 as $5,500 per year for every American family with 4 children. The following year, the NWRO raised its demand to $6,500, though Wiley never made headway with his demand for a living income. The tens of billions of dollars in welfare entitlements that he and his followers managed to squeeze from state and local governments came very close to sinking the economy, just as Cloward and Piven had predicted. In their 1966 article, Cloward and Piven had given special attention to New York City, whose masses of urban poor, leftist intelligentsia, and free-spending politicians rendered it uniquely vulnerable to the strategy they proposed. At the time, New York City welfare agencies were paying about $20 million per year in special grants. Cloward and Piven estimated that they could multiply these expenditures tenfold or more, draining an additional $180 million annually from the city coffers. New York City's arch-liberal mayor John Lindsay, newly elected in November 1966, capitulated to Wiley's every demand. An appeaser by nature, Lindsay sought to calm racial tensions by taking walking tours through Harlem, Bedford, Stuyvesant, and other troubled areas of the city. This made for good photo ops, but failed to mollify Wiley's cadres and the masses they mobilized, who wanted cash. The violence of the welfare rights movement was frightening, recalls Lindsay Budget and Charles Morris. Black militants laid siege to City Hall, bearing signs saying, "No money, no peace." Lindsay answered these provocations with ever more generous programs of appeasement in the forms of welfare dollars. New York's welfare rolls had been growing by 12% per year already before Lindsay took office. The rate jumped to 50% annually in 1966. During Lindsay's first term of office, welfare spending in New York City more than doubled from $400 million to $1 billion annually. Outlays for the poor consumed 28% of the city's budget by 1970. By the early 1970s, one person was on the welfare rolls in New York City for every two working in the city's private economy, Saul Stern wrote in the City Journal. As a direct result of its massive welfare spending, New York City was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1975. The entire state of New York went down with it. The Cloward-Piven strategy had proved its effectiveness. Crucial to Wiley's success was the cooperation of radical sympathizers inside the federal government, who supplied Wiley's movement with grants, training, and logistical assistance, channeled through federal war on poverty programs such as Vistas. The Cloward-Piven strategy depended on surprise. Once society recovered from the initial shock, the backlash began. New York's welfare crisis horrified America, giving rise to a reform movement which culminated in the end of welfare as we know it. The 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which imposed time limits on federal welfare along with strict eligibility and work requirements. Most Americans to this day have never heard of Cloward-Piven, but New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani attempted to expose them in the late 1990s. As his drive for welfare reform gained momentum, Giuliani accused the militant scholars by name, citing their 1966 manifesto as evidence that they had engaged in deliberate economic sabotage. This wasn't an accident, Giuliani charged in a July 20, 1998 speech. It was an atmospheric thing. It wasn't supernatural. This is a result of policies and programs designed to have the maximum number of people get on welfare. In a January 11, 2011 article in The Nation magazine, Francis Fox Piven would reflect upon the elements that helped make the welfare rights movement successful in the 1960s. Before people can mobilize for collective action, they have to develop a proud and angry identity and a set of claims that go with that identity. They have to go from being hurt and ashamed to being angry and indignant. Welfare moms in the 1960s did this by naming themselves mothers instead of recipients. In the same 2011 article, Piven noted that protesters needed targets, preferably local and accessible ones capable of making some kind of response to angry demands. After the welfare rights movement had run its course by the mid-1970s, Cloward-Piven never again revealed their intentions as candidly as they had in their 1966 article. Even so, their activism in subsequent years continued to rely on the tactic of overloading the system. When the public caught on to their welfare scheme, Cloward-Piven simply moved on, applying pressure to other sectors of the bureaucracy, wherever they detected weakness. In 1982, partisans of the Cloward-Piven strategy founded a new voting rights movement, which purported to take up the unfinished work of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Cloward-Piven despised America's electoral system every bit as much as they despised its welfare system, and for much the same reason. They believed that welfare checks and voting rights were mere bones tossed to the poor to keep them docile. The poor did not need welfare checks and ballots, they argued. The poor needed revolution. In her 1977 book, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeeded, How They Fail, Cloward-Piven asserted that the electoral process actually served the interests of the ruling class, providing a safety valve to drain away the anger of the poor. The authors wrote that as long as lower class groups abided by the norms governing the electoral representative system, they would have little influence. It is usually when unrest among the lower classes breaks out of the confines of electoral procedures that the poor may have some influence, as when poor people engage in strikes, riots, crime, incendiarism, massive school truancy, worker absenteeism, rent defaults, and other forms of mass defiance and institutional disruption. In 1981, Cloward-Piven wrote that poor people lose power when leaders try to turn movements into electoral organizations. That is because the capability of the poor to effect change lies in the vulnerability of societal institutions to disruption, and not in the susceptibility of these institutions to transformation through the votes of the poor. To advance the radical agenda, Cloward-Piven focused more intently on transforming the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. Because Dems profess to represent the lower classes, many poor people believed they could get what they want by voting Democrat. Thus, their energies would be channeled into useless voter activity rather than strikes, riots, incendiarism, and the like. 10 years earlier, when Cloward-Piven determined that the welfare state was acting as a safety valve for the establishment, they resolved to destroy the welfare state. The method of destruction they chose was drawn from the teachings of Saul Alinsky. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. And so they did, challenging the welfare state to pay out every penny to every person theoretically entitled to it. Alinsky called this sort of tactic mass jujitsu, using the strength of the enemy against itself. Now, Cloward-Piven concluded that the Democratic Party was also acting as a safety valve for the establishment. Thus, they would try to force Democrats to live up to their own book of rules. In effect, if the Democrats say they represent the poor, let them prove it. Cloward-Piven presented their plan in a December 1982 article titled "A Movement Strategy to Transform the Democratic Party," published in the left-wing journal Social Policy. They sought to do so to the voting system that had previously done to the welfare system. They would flood the polls with millions of new voters, drawn from the angry ranks of the underclass, all belligerent and demanding their voting rights. The result would be a catastrophic disruption of America's electoral system, the authors predicted. Cloward-Piven hoped that the flood of new voters would provoke a backlash from Democrats and Republicans alike, who would join forces to disenfranchise the unruly hordes, using such expedients as purging invalid voters from the rolls, imposing cumbersome registration procedures, stiffening residency requirements, and so forth. This voter suppression campaign would spark a political firestorm over democratic rights. They wrote, voting rights activists would descend on America's election boards and polling stations, much as George Wiley's welfare warriors had flooded local social service offices, wrote Cloward-Piven. By staging rallies, demonstrations, and sit-ins over every new restriction on registration procedures, a protest movement can dramatize the conflict. Through conflict, the registration movement will convert registering, and voting into meaningful acts of collective protest. The expected conflict would also expose the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party, which would be disrupted and transformed, the authors predicted. A new party would rise from the ashes of the old. Outwardly, it would preserve the forms and symbols of the old Democratic Party, but the new Democrats would be genuine partisans of the poor, dedicated to class struggle. This was the radical vision driving the voting rights movement. Acorn spearheaded this voting rights movement, which was led by veterans of George Wiley's welfare rights crusade. Also key to the movement were Project Vote and Human Serve, both founded in 1982. Project Vote is an Acorn front group, launched by former NWRO organizer and Acorn co-founder Zach Paulette. Human Serve was founded by Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven, along with a former NWRO organizer named Hobart James. All three of these organizations, Acorn, Project Vote, and Human Serve, set to work lobbying energetically for the so-called motor voter law, which President Bill Clinton ultimately signed in 1993. At the White House signing ceremony for this bill, both Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven were in attendance. The new law eliminated many controls on voter fraud, making it easy for voters to register, but difficult to determine the validity of new registrations. Under the new law, states were required to provide opportunities for voter registration to any person who showed up at a government office to renew a driver's license or to apply for welfare or unemployment benefits. Examiners were under orders not to ask anyone for identification or proof of citizenship, notes Wall Street Journal columnist John Fund in his book Stealing Elections. States had to permit mailing voter registrations, which allowed anyone to register without any personal contact with a registrar or election officials. Finally, States were limited in pruning dead wood, people who had died, moved, or been convicted of crimes from their rolls. The motor voter bill did indeed cause the voter rolls to be swamped with invalid registrations signed in the name of deceased, ineligible, or non-existent people, thus opening the door to the unprecedented levels of voter fraud and voter disenfranchisement claims that followed in subsequent elections during the 1990s, and culminating in the Florida recount crisis in the 2000 presidential election. On the eve of the 2000 election, in Indiana alone, state officials discovered that 1 in 5 registered voters were duplicates, deceased, or otherwise invalid. The cloud of confusion hanging over elections serves leftist agitators well. President Bush came to office without a clear mandate. The left-wing billionaire George Soros declared he was elected president by a single vote on the Supreme Court. Once again, the flood the rolls strategy had done its work. Cloward-Piven and their disciples had introduced a level of fear, tension, and foreboding to U.S. elections previously encountered mainly in third world countries. In January 2010, journalist John Funn reported that Congressman Barney Frank and U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer were preparing to unveil legislation calling for universal voter registration, whereby any person whose name was on any federal roll at all, be it a list of welfare recipients, food stamp recipients, unemployment compensation recipients, licensed drivers, convicted felons, property owners, etc., would automatically be registered to vote in political elections. Without corresponding identity verification measures at polling places, such a law would vastly expand the pool of eligible voters, thereby multiplying the opportunities for fraudulent voters to cast ballots under other people's names. Both the living wage and voting rights movements depend heavily on financial support from George Soros' Open Society Institute and his Shadow Party, through whose support the Cloward-Piven strategy continues to provide a blueprint for some of the left's most ambitious campaigns to overload and cause the collapse of various American institutions. Leftists such as Barack Obama euphemistically refer to this collapse as a fundamental transformation, on the theory that society can only be improved by destroying the deeply flawed existing order and replacing it with what they view as a better alternative. And again, that article dates back to 2015. The parallels, like I said, are rather synonymous with what we see playing out here today, as if the 16-year plan has indeed picked up steam and run amok. A lot of the same players. And of course, here is the actual article on discoverthenetworks.org. You can check that out under the Cloward-Piven strategy CPS there. I'll go ahead and drop the link out there if you wish to take a read through it. But I do have that in my own personal archives as well. That being said, well, let's flash forward into, 2014. What was Obama doing back then? The border is classic Cloward-Piven. It allows Obama to destroy America without cooperation from Congress. And again, thinking to what is playing out here today with Biden and Harris in the seat, as it were, is that not pretty much the same? Well, let's break this down. And this article out of the Blaze back in 2014 time frame says, do you ever get the feeling everyone is in on a joke except you, that maybe you are the punchline, that everyone is secretly laughing at you? Well, the joke is on America. Obama and his socialist cabal are in on the joke. Illegal aliens are in on the joke. The only ones left out are the rest of us, law-abiding, American-born citizens and taxpayers. We are the joke, and everyone knows it, but us. Do you see the picture above? It was taken yesterday by my friend, a U.S. border agent. He texted it to me direct from the processing center. It shows an illegal alien he just caught wearing a shirt with his hero's name on the back, Obama. And for whatever reason, the picture's not showing there, but nonetheless, you get the idea. We see the same thing playing out here today. Just swap the names. You got Biden on there, and of course, many of us have seen those shirts as well. Says this is an everyday occurrence, my border agent friend tells me. Obama is a secret password that goes with the secret handshake. Obama is the secret sauce that guarantees entry to the U.S. Obama is the friend, hero, messiah, and savior to every poverty-stricken foreigner illegally sneaking over the border. Everyone, everywhere in the world knows this, but the American people. The joke is on us. Says, I am Barack Obama's classmate at Columbia University, class of 83. We were taught a plan back then to collapse the U.S. economy and destroy this country. It was called Cloward-Piven, named after a husband and wife professor team at Columbia. The Cloward-Piven plan involved using spending, entitlements, debt, and crisis after crisis to overwhelm the system, distract and overwhelm the citizens, and cause the collapse of America. At this point, the people would be on their knees begging for big government to save them from drowning. They'd willingly accept a socialist nanny state without argument or debate under duress. People agree to all kinds of terrible things while their lives and survival hangs in the balance. Panic causes bad decision-making. That's the key, panic and duress. With your job gone, income gone, or facing a massive 9/11-like terrorist attack or a devastating Ebola pandemic, the country is in a panic. Cloward-Piven counted on the citizenry making a very bad decision under duress, choosing the very group that destroyed your life as your savior, meaning the government. Don't look now, but it's happening. America is crumbling, and it all comes back to the border and those illegal aliens celebrating Obama. This is no mistake. This is no coincidence. This is a plan. Obama only has 2 years left to completely destroy America. He knows as of days from now he'll probably be dealing with a Republican Senate, as well as an expanded GOP House. He knows there is a good chance he'll face impeachment hearings. He knows that his presidency is effectively over as of November 4th. He will never pass another bill. So things have to be accelerated. He must spend his last 2 years bypassing the Congress. He must find a way to collapse our economy without the need for any laws, bills, or cooperation. And of course, the answer is the border. And at the time, mind you, bankruptcy, Ebola, all that stuff was going on much to the same degree that we see it playing out here today. So I'm going to break from that article and go into the next. This one flashing forward to July 26th of 2015, penned by Chuck Norris, actually, out of WorldNet Daily. It says the Obama-Clinton Cloward-Piven baton. And it says, exclusive, Chuck Norris exposes Hillary's radical plan to carry on U.S. transformation. And again, thinking to what we know of the 16-year plan, we just said in the previous article, Obama would have had about 2 years to finish that up per the midterms, right? And of course, the plan would have been for the remaining 8 years to be carried out by HRC, except there was a little bit of a delay. This is in last week's column. I detailed in no uncertain terms how President Obama has used the Cloward-Piven strategy to dismantle our republic. This week I will detail some little-known facts about how Hillary has prepared and is preparing to receive the Cloward-Piven baton from Barack in 2016, unless, of course, she is stopped. As a reminder, the Cloward-Piven strategy is a political plan created in 1966 by two Columbia University sociologists to overload the U.S. public welfare system, with the goal to replace it with a national system of a guaranteed annual income, and thus an end to poverty. I echo again that it's neither a coincidence that Obama graduated from Columbia University, nor that others who espouse the Cloward-Piven strategy were a group of radicals who have been a part of his life and education. Bill Ayers, Saul Alinsky, Bernadine Dorn, George Wiley, Frank Marshall Davis, Wade Rathke, and George Soros, among others. What's also not a coincidence is how close Hillary ran in the same circles, like people that train at a distance under the same coach but come together to run the same relay race. So Hillary has entered the track salivating for the opportunity to grab the Cloward-Piven baton back from Barack. What's the evidence? It's abundant. The ideologies, politics, histories, and strategies of Cloward-Piven and the Clintons are more closely intertwined than most know. In the 1960s, they all were sipping from the same straw of Saul Alinsky, Chicago's notorious revolutionary Marxist community organizer, and his ideas for radical social change. First, Robert Chandler, a retired Air Force colonel and former strategist for the White House, the Department of State, Defense, Energy, and Justice, and the CIA, explained in the Washington Times that much of Cloward-Piven's strategy was drawn from Saul Alinsky. There is no doubt that Alinsky's life and work served as the coach and plan for Cloward and Piven. Second, Hillary's similar discipleship devotion was clearly seen by her 92-page college thesis paper on Saul Alinsky, which is a glimpse behind the present veil of her politically savvy and guarded gloss into the heart of her true ideologies. Even Bill Dedman, investigative reporter for NBC News, had to admit the young 21-year-old Hillary had an infatuation with the old radical from Chicago. In her own words, Hillary characterized Alinsky as possessing a compelling personality and exceptional charm. No surprise that in 1993 the Clintons asked officials at her alma mater to hide Hillary Rodham's senior thesis from Clinton biographers. At least that's what her thesis advisor and friend, Professor Ellen H. Schechter, said they wanted, after taking the call from the White House. Nevertheless, NBC's Dedman notes how David Brock, in his 1996 biography, The Seduction of Hillary Rodham, called Hillary Alinsky's daughter, and Barbara Olson, who tragically died in the September 11th attacks, used an Alinsky quote to introduce every chapter of her 1999 book, Hell to Pay, The Unfolding Story of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Olson also posited how Hillary's thesis was locked away because she does not want the American people to know the extent to which she internalized and assimilated the beliefs and methods of Saul Alinsky. Barbara Ehrenreich, Francis Fox Piven's friend, collaborator, and intellectual disciple from the American Sociological Association, spilled the beans on some early Clinton collaborations and relations with Cloward and Piven. In 1983, Francis Piven co-founded, with Cloward, a group called Human Serve, which was dedicated to the idea that if citizens were allowed to register to vote when they apply for aid from government programs or for driver's licenses, some of the historic administrative encumbrances on the right to vote could be overcome. The poor, in particular, who often lack the time for voter registration, would be effectively enfranchised. Human Serve's approach was incorporated in the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, popularly known as the Motor Voter Bill. President Bill Clinton signed the Motor Voter Bill into law, and none other than Richard Cloward and his wife, Frances Piven, were standing behind him as he did. Even Wikipedia explains that Cloward was a primary motivator for the passage of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, known as Motor Voter, which forces states' departments of motor vehicles to offer voter registration. Sounds so benign, right? Hold on. What's not surprising is how the motor voter law has morphed to incorporate more Cloward-Piven Clinton strategies. For example, in Oregon, legislators have just enacted a subsidiary law that registers a person to vote when they obtain or renew a state driver's license. That might sound all fine and dandy, too, until one realizes that a stone's throw away in neighboring states like California, they are doling out licenses to 1.5 million illegals over the next 3 years. How long will it be until California's motor voter laws extend voting rights to illegals too? And California is not alone. Nevada and Washington, also butting up against Oregon's borders, have also joined the ranks of states offering access to driver's licenses despite immigrant status. And don't forget, Hawaii, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Illinois, Vermont, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., which are also a part of that non-citizen driver's license distribution union, according to the National Immigration Law Center. You see, it's not a coincidence, either, that these new drivers and voters who have flooded and are still flooding into our country through porous borders are also at the heart of a plan to overload the U.S. welfare system under the Cloward-Piven strategy. As Rep. Steve King out of Iowa told WND, "I do feel this attempt to flood the border with illegals is a playing out of the Cloward-Piven theory." In 2010, Frances Piven, who is also one of 8 honorary chairs in the Democratic Socialists of America, gave an interview to the progressive Common Dreams in which she confessed, "The important development is the emergence of a feisty immigration movement that contemporary unions have no choice but to support, especially unions with large numbers of immigrants in the ranks. Together with students and their universities, service workers, not industrial, and immigrants, these are the constituencies that will give birth to new protest movements. You see, it's a win-win, win-win, win-win to socialist, Cloward-Piven progressives like Obama and Hillary. Illegals fled the country. Illegals get driver's licenses. Illegals get voter rights. Illegals get welfare benefits. Illegals overlord the U.S. welfare system. Illegals keep progressives in office, who crown the Cloward-Piven strategy and the fundamental transformation of America as a victory." An interesting story about Piven and her own driver's license demonstrates the power of her connection to the Clintons. As told again by her friend Barbara Ehrenreich, sometime in the mid-1990s, Frances found herself on the way to the airport without her driver's license. She called Richard at their home and asked him to find it and bring it to her at the train station. He failed to find it, and instead brought her a photo of herself and Bill Clinton taken at the time of the signing of the motor voter bill. That was enough to get Frances on the plane. A first-year political student can easily see where a Hillary presidency will take Cloward-Piven strategies. You see, the plan to fundamentally transform the United States of America has a successor, and she must be stopped. Now, mind you, again, this was penned back in 2015, but nonetheless, you get the idea where this is headed. So let's flash forward into today. How has this played out through the 2020 election and to where we currently stand? Well, Gateway Pundit had this back on August 16th. Says, "Stop the steal. Pelosi employs Cloward-Piven strategy. Accuses Trump of crime that Democrats are actually committing, stealing the 2020 election." Mind you, this was August of last year. Says earlier this month, Nevada Democrats, with the blessing of Democrat Governor Steve Sisolak, called a special session with no public present, and inside of 24 hours, they rammed through mail-in voting and illegal ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting allows Democrats not related to or friends with elderly voters to fill out their ballots and turn them in to be counted. Nevada is a swing state and a state targeted by the Trump campaign in this year's election. Dems are going to cheat at all costs to keep Nevada from going to Donald Trump. Democrats are pushing for mail-in voting across the country. They know it's easier to cheat with mail-in voting. Donald Trump and the American people stand in their way. Democrats know mail-in voting will take weeks to count. It will stir turmoil and push the Democrats to riot in the streets again like in June. This is what Dems want. And now the Dems, led by the always nasty Nancy Pelosi, are accusing President Trump of stealing the election. President Trump is trying to save the election. This is how Pelosi works. It's a Cloward-Piven strategy of governance. Accuse your opponent of the exact sins that you are guilty of. Pelosi is a genius at this game. And James Simpson reported on a Cloward-Piven strategy at the American Thinker back in 2008. The strategy was first elucidated in the May 2, 1966 issue of The Nation magazine by a pair of radical socialist Columbia University professors, Richard Andrew Cloward and Frances Fox Piven. David Horowitz summarized it as the strategy of forcing political change through orchestrated crises. The Cloward-Piven strategy seeks to hasten the fall of capitalism by overloading the government bureaucracy with a flood of impossible demands, thus pushing society into crisis and economic collapse. And I think the rest of this stuff, yep, that's out of the same Discover the Networks as I just read. Newsmax rounds out the picture. Says their strategy to create political, financial, and social chaos that would result in revolution blended Alinsky concepts with their more aggressive efforts at bringing about change in U.S. government. To achieve their revolutionary change, Cloward-Piven sought to use a cadre of aggressive organizers assisted by friendly news media to force a redistribution of the nation's wealth. Democrats and their media want the American people to believe President Trump is stealing the election. This is all while they are actively stealing the election and plotting chaos in November. And again, mind you, this was back in August prior to the election. That being said, let's move a little bit further into the year. Cloward-Piven will begin on election night, again out of WND. Brent Smith had this to say. Says, election night, it almost seems surreal to imagine that we might not have a victor that evening, or even days, weeks, or months after. I'm convinced, more than ever, that the left has known for months that Biden won't defeat Trump. Certainly not in a straight-up, fair election. So for months they've been setting up the apparatus of chaos to be prepared to act when a winner cannot be determined on November 3rd. Check that. If Trump doesn't win decisively on election night, if it's at all close, I now believe that the left's minions in the mainstream media will, in lockstep, not just state that it's too close to call, but that Trump lost. One could ask, how is that possible? Why on earth would the press risk their reputations this way? To understand this, one merely has to recall rule number 1 of leftism. If one is a leftist, one thinks and acts as an unhinged leftist first and foremost, no matter what else one is. Doctor, lawyer, journalist, whatever. It's a mental disorder, like Tourette's. They just won't be able to help themselves. Now combine hyper-leftism with Trump derangement syndrome, and you get insanity. We've witnessed TDS for long enough to know that if there is the slightest opportunity to declare Trump the loser, the left won't hesitate to shout it out, giving no thought to what damage it may cause them. Their justification to themselves will be that any mess they make can be swept back under the rug once Trump is gone. And of course, they're doing it for the good of the country. And the second this occurs, many conservatives, me included, believe that leftist big tech, also in lockstep, will suspend all Trump social media accounts, thereby preventing him from communicating directly to his base. Network, cable, and social media will effectively cut him off from his allies. All this sounds, well, insane, like something that happens in movies in third world countries, not the United States. However, as Michael Anton, a lecturer and researcher fellow at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a former national security official in the Trump administration, recently wrote, all these scenarios, these potential outcomes have already been wargamed by the anti-Trump left and deep state right. 100 Democratic grandees, anti-Trump former Republicans, and other ruling class apparatchiks got together on George Soros's dime to game out various outcomes of the 2020 election. However, I think that the key to leftist success at removing Trump will look more like the old Cloward-Piven strategy of overwhelming the system. On election night, or shortly thereafter, all leftists from mainstream media to the aforementioned big tech to prominent social media influencers, politicians on both sides, past and present, leftist military commanders, past and present, academics, Hollywood, deep state operatives, social science, and medical professionals will, with one voice, declare that Trump lost the election and must be removed from office. The cacophony of voices must be loud and constant enough that the lemming American electorate, who, because of coronavirus, has been coincidentally conditioned to do what they're told, become convinced of it and accepts that the only fair thing to do for the good of the nation, for our safety and security, is for Trump to step down. And if he doesn't, well, there is always civil war. And I say this only half kidding. So again, this was something that was penned prior to the election on how perhaps this would go down. And of course now here some months after, a little retrospective, how well did it play down? Wasn't too terribly far off, was it? That being said, let's move into this piece. Zero Hedge had this article, but had to dig and find substitute here. It says, meet the new resistance. Mark Levin rages at Democrats' Cloward-Piven chaos plan. This was penned shortly after the election now, on November 7th, 2020. And it says, Richard Andrew Cloward and Francis Fox Piven are two names that are largely unfamiliar to the average American. But as Mark Levin raged last night during an appearance on Fox's Hannity show, their historical relevance is being seen all over the country today. Outspoken conservative Mark Levin fumed at the violation of the Constitution in various states' ballot collection procedures, blasting that there's more evidence of voter fraud than there was ever evidence of Russian collusion. So those that keep saying, let's see the evidence, where the hell were you for the last 4 years? The Democrats believed in flooding the system, create chaos, grab power, and accuse your opponent of misbehavior. This is the ideology of two Marxist professors, Cloward and Piven. And now Dems are calling for unity, Levin adds. A heated moment, so I'll let this play through for just a little bit.
Justices are saying, segregate those votes. Those were done by the state Supreme Court of Pennsylvania in violation of the federal Constitution of the United States. Look, I have a lot more to say, but let me just say this before I lose my time. There's more evidence of voter fraud than there was ever evidence of Russian collusion. So those who keep saying, let's see the evidence, where the hell were you the last 4 years? You were nowhere. The Democrats went earlier and earlier voting and later counting. Now, why do they want that? More time to fix the system. I don't mean reform it. I mean fix it in their favor. They believed in flooding the system, create chaos. They've done this in a number of places. Grab power and then accuse your opponent of misbehavior. Where does that come from? Two Marxist professors, Cloward and Piven. That was their ideology. The Democrats have embraced this for years and years. Now we're supposed to have unity. Let me tell you something. I'm part of the new resistance, God forbid if our president doesn't win. They didn't give this man 1 minute of peace when he was president. Not 1 minute. State criminal investigations, federal criminal investigations, congressional investigation, phony impeachment, coup attempts, the Obama-Biden administration with the FBI spies and all the rest. At no time during the last 4 years did Joe Biden say, let's unite around our president. So, Mr. Biden, God forbid if you're president, but I personally intend to treat you the same way Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Jim Acosta, Fredo Cuomo, and all the rest of them treated my president. So I am not uniting around this man any more than they united around our man. But it ain't over till it's over. And let's see what the Supreme Court does, and let's see what happens in these other cases because they're vital. And by the way, in 2000, when we had the challenge, Al Gore had 37 days. We're in one state chasing Chads. We have multiple states. The president needs more time.
All right, so we get the idea there. Obviously, Mark Levin was fired up at the time, but nonetheless, we see how things panned out as a result. And at the end of the day, I believe that the Cloward-Piven strategy worked very well to their advantage. That being said, carrying forward Cloward-Piven strategy to destroy America resurgent amid BLM Antifa-led riots. This dating back to August of last year as well. Says Richard Andrew Cloward and Francis Fox Piven are two names largely familiar to Americans. I think this is a little bit of a repeat of the previous article. Here we go. It says, as Brandon Smith detailed previously, in the mid-60s, at the height of the social revolution, the line between democratic benevolence and outright communism became rather blurry. The Democratic Party, which controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress, was used as a springboard by social engineers to introduce a new era of welfare initiatives enacted in the name of defending the poor, also known as the Great Society programs. These initiatives, however, were driven by far more subversive and extreme motivations and have been expanded on by every presidency since, Republican and Democrat alike. At Columbia University, sociologist professors Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven introduced a political strategy in 1966 in an article entitled The Weight of the Poor, A Strategy to End Poverty. The article outlined a plan that they believed would eventually lead to the total transmutation of America into a full-fledged, centralized welfare state. In other words, a collectivist enclave. The spear point of the Cloward-Piven strategy involved nothing less than economic sabotage against the U.S. Theoretically, according to the doctrine, a condition of overwhelming tension and strain could be engineered through the overloading of American welfare rolls, thereby smothering the entitlement program structure at the state and local level. The implosion of welfare benefits would facilitate a massive spike in poverty and desperation, creating a financial crisis that would lead to an even greater cycle of demand for a fully socialized system. This desperation would then force the federal government to concentrate all welfare programs under one roof, nationalize and enforce a socialist ideology, and ultimately compact on immense level of power into the hands of a select few. Cloward and Piven claimed that this could be accomplished by a grassroots level through community activism, and that it would facilitate a more compassionate federal authority. However, there are numerous problems with these assertions. The Cloward-Piven strategy has nothing to do with grassroots activism, and accomplishes nothing tangible for the downtrodden poverty class. In fact, I would dare to say that Cloward and Piven, as well as most social engineers, are well aware that the corrupt ultimately only served to give even more dominance to the establishment and pilfer even more freedom from the masses. Cloward-Piven is not limited to the destabilization of state and local welfare programs. It can easily be used against federal-level entitlements, and in reality is much more effective against an entity with the proven tendency towards exponential debt spending. Though the federal government may be able to borrow fiat dollars through the Federal Reserve to prolong welfare rolls, while the states cannot, a more volatile threat arises when debt monetization begins to wear down the purchasing power of the currency. Weakened purchasing power results in reduced consumer activity, less industrial growth, less GDP, and obviously more poverty. The dollar has lost approximately 98% of its purchasing power since 1972, and after 50 years of the so-called war on poverty, nearly one-third of the American population now repeatedly slips under the official poverty line. In the past decade alone, the number of people dependent on food stamps and EBT for their survival in the U.S. has doubled from 25 million people to nearly 50 million people. Those who receive some kind of payment from the government, including those on Social Security, disability, and veterans benefits, are approximately 100 million. Americans on Social Security do not consider themselves welfare recipients because they paid into the system. However, the point remains that if the federal money tap shuts down due to overwhelming participation, the checks will stop whether you paid into the system or not. In the end, it is the federal government itself that is most vulnerable to the Cloward-Piven strategy, and I believe the goal is to set fire to all social structures in the U.S., then assimilate them into a new globalist system. But as ominous as all that sounds, we need to back a little further, since it was Saul Alinsky, an American community activist and political theorist in Chicago, that was the inspiration for Cloward and Piven. Alinsky grew impatient with the new leftist activists in the 1960s. In his book Rules for Radicals, which is dedicated to Lucifer, he states, "Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules," from Alinsky's 1972 book. Says when forced to do that, human agendas inevitably fall short. This gives the opportunity to replace the capitalist rule book with a socialist one. The strategy was to mobilize people in poverty en masse to overwhelm the government agencies with a flood of demands beyond these agencies' capacity. This creates gridlock, and the aim was to bring the system down. Alinsky had contact with Hillary Clinton. You can see her letter to him in 1971. Clinton wrote her college thesis on Alinsky and his organizing plan. Also, Barack Obama taught Alinsky 101 at the University of Chicago. How much Alinsky's concepts actually influenced Clinton and Obama is open to debate. See David Horowitz's book, Barack Obama's Rules for Revolution, the Alinsky Model, for more information. Other organizations rose up, such as ACORN, with the issue of voting rights. These organizations received support from people like George Soros, but that is another story. Now, let's look at the playbook that developed from Cloward-Piven's ideas. These steps have been incorrectly attributed, many to Saul Alinsky. While it is true that he didn't write them, this much is true. The actual plan is real. It was inspired by Alinsky and enumerated by Cloward and Piven. Some people will react to this list, others will say that some of the steps are desirable goals. Nonetheless, you can quickly see how they fit into the socialistic goals of far-left politicians and others today. The 8 steps to create a socialist state. Number 1. Healthcare. Control healthcare and you control the people. Happening now. 2. Poverty. Increase the poverty level as high as possible. Poor people are easier to control and will not fight back if you are providing everything for them to live. Happening now. 3. Debt. Increase the debt to an unsustainable level. That way you are able to increase taxes, and this will produce more poverty. Happening now. Number 4. Gun control. Remove the ability to defend themselves from the government. That way you are able to create a police state. Happening now. Number 5. Welfare. Take control of every aspect of their lives. Food, housing, and income. And that, of course, is happening now. Number 6. Education. Take control of what people read and listen to. Take control of what children learn in school. Already done. Number 7. Religion. Remove the belief in the God from the government and schools, and that's pretty well already done. And number 8. Class warfare. Divide the people into the wealthy and the poor. This will cause more discontent, and it will be easier to tax the wealthy with the support of the poor. Happening now. So right now, as Jeffrey Greater explains, steps 1 through 5 and 8 are being executed right now in how our government is reacting to the COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak, with steps 6 and 7 already having been implemented since 2008. The American economy is being split into pieces right now by the combination of a $2 trillion bailout, with more coming, Americans under stay-at-home orders, and with more people right now on unemployment in 2 weeks of the coronavirus crisis than in the second year of the Great Depression of 1929. In fact, as Jeffrey Greater explains, the Cloward-Piven plan to collapse the American economy first began under President Obama. As you will see here in this program by Glenn Beck from 2009, but for whatever reason, Obama and his minions were not able to fully implement Cloward-Piven. We thought we dodged a bullet with the election of Trump in 2016. So why are we seeing what Obama started now being thrust upon us? This video will fully explain the Cloward-Piven strategy to you, and when you understand it, you will understand what you are watching happen right now with the coronavirus outbreak. And unfortunately, that particular video must have already been scrubbed off of YouTube, so guessing probably you could find that somewhere, digging through some archives with old Glenn Beck, probably on his whiteboards, I would imagine, from days past. And it says, and this does not end well. As Brandon Smith previously noted, if we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of making the developing crisis about a singularly unimportant thing, then the elites get exactly what they want. An angry and desperate citizenry out for blood of a middleman and out for the blood of each other, while they sit back, relax, and wait to swoop in as our financial saviors with strings attached. For those naive enough to assume that Cloward-Piven is just a well-intentioned activist method, it is important to understand that even if that were so, the effect of the Cloward-Piven strategy will never achieve the goal its creators claim to support. In my view, it is probable that they never really intended for it to produce wealth equality or an increased quality of life. The tactic can only decrease wealth security by making all citizens equally destitute. As we have seen in numerous socialist and communist experiments over the past century, economic harmonization never creates wealth or prosperity. It only siphons wealth from one area and redistributes it to the others, evaporating much of it as it has squeezed through the grinding gears of the establishment machine. Socialism, in its very essence, elevates government to the role of all-pervasive parent and casts the citizenry down into the role of dependent, sniveling infant. Even in its most righteous form, Cloward-Piven seeks to make infants of us all, whether we like it or not. The key to achieving this is simple. Don't waste a crisis. That is exactly what has happened in 2020, especially as it involved more than one crisis. The COVID-19 crisis. This pandemic has affected the lives of everyone. It has been 100 years since we have had anything like it. Tragically, people have died, and hospitals and the healthcare system have sought to overcome it. It has wrecked the economy, which was doing incredibly well before the pandemic. COVID-19 has been a major crisis. George Floyd's death. The death of George Floyd, while in the custody of police officers in Minneapolis in May, set off a firestorm of protests that have, in certain places, resulted in violence and destruction of property. In turn, this has resulted in issues related to police reform, law and order, etc. This, too, has been a major crisis. Now, put these two crises together, and people both in the community and in politics have sought to promote wholesale changes in society. Not just defunding the police, but more radical socialist goals for society. Remember, Black Lives Matter, which has been so easily endorsed by individuals and organizations, was founded by Marxist communists, who embraced socialist beliefs and positions. Simply put, that there are some who are taking advantage of the current crisis in America to promote far-reaching socialist goals that would change society radically for years to come. Don't believe us? Here's an interview with Frances Fox Piven from earlier this month, as she discusses why disruption must be central to protests, the thorny questions of violence and property destruction. And I think I'll break from that there. I think we get the idea. Nonetheless, one last one to round things out here tonight to kind of square things up with where we presently are. This one penned here just about a week or so ago. President Cloward and Vice President Piven. This comes by way of American Thinker. It says Cloward-Piven is a political strategy of calculated chaos first described in 1966 by the two Columbia University sociologists Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven. Their theory was published appropriately in the far left The Nation, the oldest continuously published news magazine in the country. Cloward-Piven's goal was the creation of chaos so that a political crisis would result that could lead to legislation for a guaranteed annual income and thus an end to poverty. The activities of the past year, from an imported Chinese coronavirus to a rigged and stolen presidential election, are textbook Cloward-Piven, leading to a massive shift in the leadership and direction of America. We have gone to government by, of, and for the people to a tyrannical autocracy controlled by a small cabal of self-appointed elites. Welcome to President Cloward and Vice President Piven, or vice versa for those who believe the current vice president is really in charge, rather than the cognitively impaired president in name only. Cloward-Piven's objective is chaos and turmoil, or, in their words, a massive drive to recruit the poor into the welfare rolls. This is followed by a federal program of income redistribution has become necessary to elevate the poor en masse from poverty. Is there any better recap of COVID, including lockdowns, closed businesses, schools, and churches, requiring the ruling class spending trillions of dollars they don't have to rectify the damage and destruction unleashed by the same ruling class that they now want to correct it? The so-called stimulus is massive income redistribution, from the producers to the non-producers, who are in their situation either by choice or through the diktats of the ruling class, and their decisions which turn producers into non-producers. The stimulus will result in much of the middle class and states in general to further dependency on the federal government sustenance. In Cloward-Piven's terms, a crisis is a publicly visible disruption in some institutional sphere. How do they create such a crisis? Crisis can occur spontaneously and affect riots, or as the intended result of tactics of demonstration and protest, which either generate institutional disruption or bring unrecognized disruption to public attention. Think of the George Floyd protests and riots, a convenient excuse for institutional disruption. Institutions of law and order suffered disruption from calls to defund the police to blatant disregard for private property and businesses. A pre-planned riot at the Capitol on January 6 created a false panic and a rushed certification of the Electoral College votes without scrutiny or review. Congress rubber-stamping a fraudulent election. It had the bonus of allowing a bogus impeachment of President Trump, kicking a man already down as a giant middle finger to Trump and his millions of supporters. Cloward-Piven did not begin with the Trump presidency, but during FDR's New Deal, then further codified in the 1960s when it was given a name. This included Medicare, Medicaid, and the Great Society welfare programs. New government agencies and bureaucracies choked innovation and economic growth. Ill-conceived and endless wars, expansion of food stamps, Medicaid, and other social welfare programs resulted in the majority of Americans receiving government benefits. A crisis led to each of these programs. Seniors and the poor unable to afford their medical care gave us Medicare and Medicaid. The government replacing stay-at-home fathers created the welfare state. A shortage of reliable Democratic voters was rectified by opening our borders to anyone, providing them with free benefits in exchange for not biting or voting against the hand that feeds them. Democrats offer programs unpopular and unappealing to the majority of Americans. Cloward-Piven is how they muscle their agenda through. It is their only strategy, accomplishing through chaos, fear, and coercion what is unreachable via the ballot box. Bringing down the current system provides an opportunity to remake American society into their idealized version of utopia, which in reality is the Soviet Union, Cuba, or China, with a small ruling class in charge, and everyone else subservient. In other words, a real-life Hunger Games dystopian society. Donald Trump was simply a speed bump on the Cloward-Piven Expressway. He was supposed to blow up the road to serfdom, but instead only slowed it down for a few years. The deep state won easily. I wonder if Trump even stood a chance. Did he simply provide an opportunity for the deep state to test their new strategies of weaponizing the government against political opponents and rigging elections to the point that they are irrelevant? Now we have rule, not by our elected representatives, but by a senile old man, signing executive orders put in front of him, orders created by his puppet masters hiding behind the curtains. COVID restrictions and lockdowns created such economic carnage that an entirely new dependency class was born. Add to that tens of millions of illegal immigrants bringing dependency as well as potential health care concerns and costs and animosity toward the country paying all their bills, displacing American workers already struggling to regain their footing after COVID. Any resistance is met with protests and riots. Those who speak out may be canceled or worse. The media simply parrots the talking points of the ruling class, acting like court eunuchs for the ruling establishment. Massive income redistribution via government programs with attacks on the First and Second Amendment make it impossible for the people to push back, either verbally or physically, against a tyrannical government, all to supposedly end poverty by making everyone poor and calling it the middle class. Universal income doesn't eliminate poverty, it simply expands it, but under a different name, something trendy like equity. Putting dog poop on a scoop of ice cream and calling it an ice cream sundae doesn't make it so. except in the eyes of the government that defines the acceptable terms. You can be sure that guaranteed annual income will simply create a subservient lower class, eager to vote for their paymasters each November, as long as they keep dripping narcotics dollars into their wallets. Not enough to climb the economic ladder, but enough to keep them satisfied. The productive ones, pulling on the economic oars, will eventually tire from their efforts and take their guaranteed stipend and let someone else row the boat. Those in charge will live lavishly as they did in the capital city of the Hunger Games. Chaos and confusion, fear and uncertainty in a never-ending stream, courtesy of the government, solved with executive orders by the same government designed to fix the very problems they created. All of this is being ushered in under the whip of President Cloward and Vice President Piven. And it seems the entire ruling class, regardless of political party, has signed on. And so there you have it. Kind of round things out. Where we leave things here at the moment. We still see the borders wide open. By design. We see the bankrupting of America, shutting down of small businesses, the ruling classes net dictating what can and can't be open. And of course, more and more people on the government teat, as it were, waiting for the handouts, right? So how do we get out of it? Is there a way out of it? Absolutely. It's called creating jobs, getting the government out of the way, period. And we don't need the government to tell us what we can or cannot do. Simply, eliminate licenses. Eliminate a lot of things, the red tape. Let the people get on with their lives and do as they see fit. The red states are doing that today. Blue states, not so much. So, definitely going to have more to say about it in upcoming episodes, but I thought it would behoove us to take a little step back, understand exactly what the old Cloward-Piven strategy is. Again, this isn't new. This is something drummed up in the 60s, and of course we saw 44 implement it fairly well. And of course, as Trump kind of got in the way for about 4 years' time, here we see it ramped up, going full steam ahead yet again, as if to try and put a coronation, as it were, on the end of the 16-year plan in quick succession. So again, I'll have a lot more to say about that in subsequent episodes, but until then, appreciate you guys tuning in here for the broadcast here this evening. As always, stick around. We'll be back again later on for another episode of Midnight Rider right here. So take care. God bless everybody.